Hello ELT132, this is Roger Young, and this video is going to be in regards to encoders. Now last week we discussed decoders, and decoders, if you recall, went from few to many, and when I say few to many I'm talking about the inputs, and this is an example here of an encoder, and an encoder actually goes from many to few. So if you think of this side here as your inputs, right? And if this side over here is your outputs, right? You can see that you have 8 inputs, D0 to D7, and you have 3 outputs, right? This should make sense to you because 2 to the third equals 8, right? So the largest binary number you could generate with this is 7, and the smallest would be 0, and 0 to 7 gives you 8 lines, hence you have 8 right here. Let me fix that too. There you go. Alright, so if we look over here to the right, we see a table from the textbook, and this represents a 3-bit encoder. Don't worry about the word priority yet. We're going to talk about that. But just a general decoder. What this says is if you have D7 active, in this case it's a 1, and everything else inactive, if all these others are 0, you're going to have 1, 1, 1 on the output. Q0 would be 1, Q1 would be 1, Q2 would be 1. All right? Just as they show here. Binary, this value binary in binary equals the decimal number 7, and that's the line you had high. Now we could do this exercise for D6, D5, D4, D3, D2, D1, and it's the same argument. If D1 is high, that means Q0 would be high and Q1 and Q2 would be 0. That's equal to the decimal number 1. And since D1 was active, you're going to have a binary number 1 coming out, right? Which is equal to a decimal number 1, I'm sorry. So I want to address this right now because this is what you're going to be doing in lab. You may notice that there is no 1 up here for D0. So if you think about it, D1 through D7 causes one of the bits on the output to have a 1 in it, right? It has to represent a number. If the value D0 is put in here, it's going to output all zeros, isn't it? So it's not going to cause the output to output anything high. That's why it's not included. So it doesn't change the output. So we're going to discuss more in this in lab. If you have any questions, obviously bring them up in class. But in a short version, that's what's happening. Now, let's talk about what priority means. You have this word here, priority, right? Priority means that it's going to use the highest value input. So if you have 6, 5, that's D4 right there. Suppose D4 was active and D7 was active. What would it output? Well, the answer to that question is it would output the highest value, which would be D7. So it would output a 1, 1, 1. And the reason why these X's are here is because those signify that the value could be a 0 or could be a 1. It doesn't really matter. If the highest value here is a 1, it's going to output 7. Now do you notice when you go through here, everything below, for a priority encoder, every input line with less priority, in other words, in this case D3, D2, D0, it doesn't matter what they are, it's going to output D4. However, D5, D6, and D7 must be 0. And that makes sense. Because if D5 was a 1, all right, it would be high, right? And that means that D4 would no longer be the highest priority. It would be D5, which means it would obviously output a 5, which would be in this row. All right? So you're going to be given problems, some encoder problems, and this is what I drew here for you. I'll draw the same one again. So they're going to ask you, and they could even have 16 lines coming in, but usually 8 is what they do. So you'll have 3 outputs coming over here. And just say this is Q0, this is Q1, and this is Q2. All right? So 0, 1, and 2. Suppose you have D1. Let's have a D1 here too. Suppose with this input you had D1 and active and D4 active. Everything else was 0. What would it output? Well, the output would be D4, right? Because it has a higher priority. So with D4 active, right here, this is what it would output, 0, 0, 1. And this is equal to a decimal value of 4, because this is binary. And that's your 4th line. We said that D1 was also active. But you know what? That doesn't matter because it's at a lower priority. The highest priority wins, and that's what the encoder outputs. And you know what? That's pretty much it for encoders. So encoders go from many to few, and they're going to output, you're going to take whatever line you have coming in there, they're going to have the binary output of that line. So if it's D4, it's going to output a binary value of decimal number 2. If D7 is active, it's going to output the binary value for decimal 7. And the same keeps going. So these decoders generally are 8-bit. Sometimes they're going to have 16-bit. I mean, you can have more than 8-bit. But I think 8-bit is generally how the text does this stuff. Now remember, these inputs could be active high, and they could be active low. All right, same with the outputs. All right, so when you're doing the problems or working in lab, make sure you understand if they're active high or active low. All right, I hope this has been helpful to you. And any questions, obviously let me know. Thank you. Bye-bye.